The shutdown wasn't supposed to be permanent. It was only meant to scare him, remind him that the system he treated like a toy was actually a living thing, one I built line by line, safeguard by safeguard, over 8 years. But when the CEO laughed in my face that morning and told me, "You're replaceable," the system runs itself, something in me clicked. Not anger. Not ego. Just clarity. If he truly believed that, then he deserved to experience the exact opposite. The day started with his usual theatrics. He summoned me to the glass conference room, surrounded by board members who nodded along like bobbleheads. He didn't bother sitting down. He just paced, waving a printed email, my email, where I'd warned them about critical security drift, missing patches, and undocumented changes made by the outsourced team he hired to modernize our infrastructure. He jabbed a finger at me. "You worry too much. And worry isn't a deliverable." The board chuckled. He added, "We need aggressive thinkers. Not system monks." I knew I was done. Not fired, just done. There's a point where you outgrow the people trying to diminish you. So I walked out without arguing, without defending myself, without trying to convince them of the danger they were in. People only learn from consequences, not warnings. By noon, the company's internal systems were humming with errors. Little ones. Harmless on their own. A routing loop here. A memory leak there. The kinds of anomalies that usually only worry people like me. But stacked together, they were the first tremors before a collapse. At 12:47 p.m., I received the first panicked message. At 1:10, the second. At 1:38, the CEO himself called with a voice suddenly stripped of arrogance. I answered only because I wanted him to hear how calm I was. "Everything's shutting down," he stammered. "Payroll. Logistics. Cloud sync. POS systems. All frozen. What's happening?" I told him the truth. "You built a skyscraper on quicksand and ignored every warning that the ground was shifting." He tried threatening me. He tried bargaining. He tried pretending we were a team. But what he didn't understand was that the system wasn't failing because of something I did. It was failing because of everything they refused to do. At 2:03 p.m., the entire infrastructure went into failsafe mode, a deep freeze built into the system years ago. Not a sabotage tool. A protection mechanism. One the CEO had ordered removed but never actually followed through on because implementing it required my authentication. Which meant he had no way around it. The shutdown echoed across all operations, warehouses, billing APIs, vendor networks, inventory pipelines. 100,000 automated processes, all waiting on one missing piece, the override key held by the replaceable system monk. He called again, breathing like he'd run a marathon. "Tell me what you want." "I want you," I said, "to tell the board the truth." There was a long silence. Then another voice came on, calmer, older. The board chairman. "We're listening," he said. So I told them that the system wasn't broken. It was protecting itself from the instability introduced by their shortcuts, their consultants, their obsession with cutting expertise and replacing it with buzzwords and pitch decks. I told them they didn't need me back. They just needed to stop pretending complexity bows to arrogance. They reinstated my position by 3:21 p.m. with a higher salary, full operational authority, and a written acknowledgement from the CEO himself that his decisions had destabilized the company. By 6 p.m., the system was fully restored. By 6:15, the CEO submitted his voluntary resignation. And by the end of the week, the board had officially adopted a rule: no major system decision without written approval from the department responsible for it. A simple sentence, but a powerful one. It meant logic finally outweighed ego. I didn't destroy the company. I didn't sabotage anything. All I did was step aside and let reality speak for itself. And reality has the sharpest voice of all. They didn't promote me immediately. Contrary to every dramatic corporate story, there was no parade, no applause, no sudden coronation where they handed me the CEO's chair. What happened was quieter, sharper, and far more satisfying. The morning after the shutdown, the board called an urgent cultural audit meeting. They flew in early, still rattled from the chaos. Some looked exhausted, some embarrassed. And all of them looked different without the CEO in the room, less performative, more human. They asked not for my loyalty, but for my report. For years, I'd been writing reports nobody read. Warnings nobody acted on. Risk assessments tucked into inboxes, unread until the damage was already done. This time, every word landed like a brick. I walked them through 8 years of instability created by rushed modernization, half-integrated cloud expansions, and an outsourced security team that wasn't even trained on our legacy systems. I showed them the compounding errors, the misaligned permissions, the dependency chains so tangled that one system's update could cripple 5 others. By the time I finished, the room was silent. Not embarrassed silence. Not bored silence. The kind of silence people have when they finally understand the scope of the fire they almost burned in. Finally, the chairman exhaled and said, "We didn't just undervalue you. We built an entire strategy on the assumption we didn't need people like you." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. They offered me a new contract, one built with the seriousness the job required. A director-level position. Autonomy over infrastructure. A budget. A team of my choosing. But what mattered most wasn't the power, the title, or the money. It was the clause I insisted on adding, just one sentence: no executive may override core system protocols without written authorization from the Director of Infrastructure. That was the real victory. Not revenge. Not humiliation. Not watching a CEO crumble under the weight of his own ego. The victory was building something that would outlast the fools who thought expertise was optional. Over the next months, I rebuilt the system the right way: clean architecture, proper documentation, real failovers, security that didn't depend on hope. We fixed the cracks before they became earthquakes. The new team respected the work, understood the stakes, and never once used the phrase "good vibes" in an engineering meeting. Every now and then, someone asked me what really happened during the shutdown. If I'd pulled a secret lever. If I'd flipped some master switch that disabled the company. I always gave the same answer: I didn't break anything. I just stopped holding up the parts they refused to maintain. Truth is, that's how most collapses happen, not from sabotage, but from neglect disguised as confidence. And sometimes the most strategic move you can make is to simply let people feel the consequences of the arrogance they thought protected them. The funny thing is, people started treating me like some sort of corporate myth after that. The quiet engineer who'd once been talked over in meetings now had executives pausing mid-sentence when I entered a room. Folks who'd barely acknowledged me in the hallway suddenly wanted to pick my brain about systems they didn't even know existed 2 months earlier. I didn't let it change much about how I worked, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel good. Still, the real shifts were deeper than office politics. The new CEO, appointed by the board with much less ceremony than the last one, was a pragmatic, detail-oriented woman named Eris. She invited me to her office within her first week. No theatrics, no ego. Just a simple question: what do you need to make sure this never happens again? I gave her the honest list: time, talent, authority, a culture that respects expertise over charisma. She gave me all 4. With that, the company turned into something I hadn't seen in years, a place where thoughtful design trumped flashy presentations, where engineers were included before disasters, not after, and where leadership listened before they assumed. But closure, real closure, came 3 months later. I was leaving the building late one evening when the ex-CEO's former Innovation Task Force intern, who once called my work prehistoric, approached me near the elevators. She looked uncomfortable, almost nervous. "Hey, can I ask you something?" she said. I nodded. "Did you intentionally let it break back then?" I looked at her. Young. Overconfident. Trained to believe speed was brilliance. She represented the culture that nearly destroyed the company. So I told her the truth. I didn't let anything break. I just stopped absorbing the impact of other people's shortcuts. She stared at me like the concept was new, a slow dawning realization that systems, like careers, are often held together by the invisible labor of people no one thanks until it's gone. As she left, I could see the thought settling into her. Maybe competence wasn't boring. Maybe experience wasn't old tech. Maybe some foundations exist for a reason. And as the elevator doors closed, I understood something too. Revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the moment the world realizes the difference between those who build stability and those who only inherit it. In the end, the shutdown didn't make me powerful. It made the truth undeniable. And in corporate warfare, that's the cleanest victory there is. The real epilogue came almost a year later, long after the shutdown had become a cautionary tale whispered in conference rooms and quietly studied in leadership workshops. By then, the company was stable again, profitable again, and more importantly, sane again. Engineers weren't political pawns. Leaders weren't chasing buzzwords like toddlers chasing shiny toys. And systems weren't being rewritten by people who didn't know the difference between a backup and a snapshot. But fate has a way of tying loose ends when you least expect it. It happened at an industry tech summit, one of those massive, overproduced events with holographic stage effects and keynote speakers who think pausing dramatically equals depth. I was there because the new CEO insisted, said the company needed a voice grounded in reality. So I went, wearing the same quiet expression I always had, blending in with the other mid-level engineers, the ones actually keeping the world from catching on fire. Then I saw him. The old CEO. The man who once bragged about turning the company into a disruption titan, now sitting alone at a high-top table near the back of the hall. No entourage. No camera crew. No badge marking him as a speaker. Just a regular attendee. He noticed me. Hesitated. Then stood, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Irony, huh?" he said. "Me seeing you here." I nodded politely. "Industry's small." He laughed once, bitterly. "You know, people think you took everything from me." I didn't say anything. It wasn't necessary. But the truth is, he continued, lowering his voice, I did it to myself. You didn't destroy anything. You just stopped saving me. That caught me off guard. Not because he was wrong, but because he finally understood. And in that moment, standing under cold conference center lighting with the smell of burnt coffee in the air, I saw him not as a villain, but as a man who had mistaken confidence for competence, speed for strategy, bravado for leadership. "I hope you're doing better," I finally said. He shrugged. "Consulting gigs. Small stuff. People like cautionary tales, I guess." We exchanged a few more words, nothing dramatic. Then he walked away, swallowed by the crowd of neon-lit booths and salespeople reciting memorized pitches. As he disappeared, I felt something I hadn't expected, not triumph. Not lingering anger. Just closure. Revenge had ended months ago. What remained was something quieter and sharper. Relevance. Because while he wandered from gig to gig, clinging to fragile reputation, I returned to a company that finally ran on discipline instead of delusion. A company that trusted me. A company I'd helped rebuild. And when I stepped onto the stage later that afternoon to speak, introduced not as IT, not as legacy, not as the guy who fixed things, but as chief systems architect, I understood the real win. It wasn't the shutdown. It wasn't the fallout. It wasn't even the new title. It was that, in a world obsessed with disruption, the person who saved everything was the one who refused to be flashy. The one who stayed consistent. The one who understood the system, inside and out. The one they underestimated, until the day everything depended on him. Sometimes revenge is a single moment. But sometimes, it's the life you build after they realize they never should have let you go. The applause faded, but the sense of clarity stayed with me long after I stepped off the stage. A few younger engineers crowded around, eager, bright-eyed, faces that reminded me of who I'd been years earlier, back when I still believed companies rose and fell based purely on merit. One of them, a quiet kid named Lyle, finally asked the question the others were too polite to voice: "Is it true what people say? That you shut everything down yourself?" I smiled, not confirming, not denying. "Let's just say," I answered, "a system is only as resilient as the leadership that respects it." They loved that line. Took notes, even. But the truth was richer. Because what happened next was the part of the story no one outside the company ever heard. After the shutdown incident, after the board cleaned house, after the chaos settled, I was given access to everything: full architecture oversight, long-term authority, the right to say no without being overruled by a buzzword-drunk executive. And with that authority came discoveries. Not breaches. Not hacks. Worse. Shortcuts. Layers and layers of them. The ex-CEO had been building a future where nothing was documented, nothing was repeatable, and everything relied on personal charisma rather than engineering discipline. He'd carved holes in the infrastructure to push projects faster, but those holes were metastasizing into existential threats. So the first months of my new role weren't glamorous, they were surgical. Pulling out landmines one by one. Rewriting entire services. Rebuilding teams. Replacing the illusion of speed with the reality of safety. That's when the board realized something chilling: if I hadn't triggered the shutdown, the company would have collapsed on its own within a year. What they once treated as revenge, they now understood as a controlled burn that saved the forest. And once that truth settled into the top floor offices, once the new leadership understood the difference between disruption and irresponsibility, my place in the company solidified in a way no promotion could ever replicate. Months later, on a rainy Thursday evening, the new CEO called me into her office. "You know," she said, pouring tea into 2 ceramic mugs instead of sliding a memo across her desk, "we never thanked you properly." "I didn't do it for gratitude," I said. "I know. That's why you deserve it." She handed me a sealed envelope. Inside wasn't money or a bonus. It was a contract. 5 years. Full strategic autonomy. Veto power on any technological initiative. And a clause, my favorite, that explicitly prevented any executive from overriding system safeguards unless I approved. A clause written because of the shutdown. A clause inspired by the downfall of the old CEO. A clause that effectively made me the backbone of the company. "You saved us," she said simply. "No," I replied. "We saved ourselves once the wrong person was gone." And that was the cleanest truth. You don't destroy a company by revealing its weakness. You save it by refusing to hide the weaknesses leadership refuses to see. By the time I left the CEO's office that night, the city lights reflecting in the windows like stars trapped in grids, I finally understood the shape of my revenge. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It wasn't even intentional. It was structural. The old CEO had built a company that depended on his ego. I rebuilt one that didn't depend on anyone's. And there's no sweeter revenge than leaving behind something that thrives, a monument to every decision they laughed at, ignored, or dismissed. Revenge ends. Legacy doesn't. But the story didn't actually end with that contract. Revenge never stops at the dramatic peak. There's always the quiet epilogue, the slow, subtle ripple effect that changes everything afterward. It started with a phone call. Not to me, about me. Former executives, the ones who'd fled the building the morning of the shutdown, had started shopping a narrative to outside companies. They wanted to bury their embarrassment by reframing me as unstable, reckless, dangerously overpowered. A convenient villain in their own downfall. The problem was, the industry had already heard the real story. When the old CEO tried to spin the tale to an investor group, claiming an employee shut down our systems without authorization, the investor leaned back, folded his arms, and asked, and whose policies allowed one employee enough control to do that? Their faces apparently paled in perfect synchrony. That question began traveling through boardrooms like a wind-blown spark through dry fields. By the end of the month, every executive who'd tried to smear me found themselves being quietly declined for roles they believed they were entitled to. Recruiters stopped returning calls. Reference checks came back with chilly, careful language. Not because I asked for it. Not because I lifted a finger. But because competent companies don't hire leaders who let their infrastructure become a single point of catastrophic failure, and then blame the engineer who fixed it. The industry didn't blacklist them. They blacklisted themselves. And as their options dwindled, something else happened. People from my company, engineers, analysts, even mid-level managers, began sending me messages late at night. Thank you. We finally feel safe building again. You saved our jobs. The new leadership listens now. Every note, every quiet message, every hallway smile told me the same thing. I hadn't just shut a system down. I'd shut down an entire era of arrogance. When the annual tech summit rolled around, I walked the floor not as an employee who once pulled the emergency brake, but as someone whose judgment the industry now actively sought. Panels wanted my insights. Startups wanted my consultation. Even government agencies, ones who don't usually admit they need help, asked me to advise on infrastructure resilience. Funny how quickly the world changes when truth gets oxygen. Months later, I found out the final consequence of that infamous shutdown. The old CEO had been trying to launch a new venture, pitching investors the same seductive nonsense that once dazzled ours. But no one bit. Not one. The rumor? Every investor asked the single question, who built your systems? And when he couldn't say me, the conversation ended. Revenge doesn't always look like fire and fury. Sometimes it's just reality catching up to the people who ran from it. As for me, I never needed to brag. Never needed to defend myself. Never needed to explain what really happened that day. My career didn't collapse. It crystallized. One controlled shutdown. One moment of clarity. One decision that toppled a king and built a kingdom. And the best part? Every time the company lights hum on at dawn, every time a new engineer deploys code safely, every time a system update runs without fear, the legacy of that shutdown lives on, not as destruction, but as design. Revenge was the spark. Rebuilding became the masterpiece. In the end, the shutdown became more than a story, it became a timestamp. A line between before and after. Before, a company dazzled by buzzwords, silencing the people who actually kept it alive. A leadership team convinced that charisma outweighed competence. A culture that dismissed caution as negativity and experience as legacy. After, a company rebuilt on reality, not delusion. A leadership team that knew exactly how close they had come to losing everything. A culture that finally respected the scaffolding of quiet, necessary labor that had always held it together. As for me, I didn't walk away with dramatic fireworks or a mic drop exit. No, you don't win by burning the place down. You win by forcing the people in power to see the truth, then watching them rebuild themselves around it. The old CEO tried to reinvent himself, but reputations, like systems, remember what happened. His downfall wasn't my victory. His downfall was simply the natural consequence of ignoring the people who warned him the rails were bending. My victory was quieter, better, lasting. It was the calm respect in the eyes of new engineers who'd grown up hearing the tale of the singular shutdown. It was the board's willingness to listen instead of lecture. It was the company thriving because its foundations were finally taken seriously. And it was the knowledge that I didn't have to prove anything anymore. The system I once protected now ran because of principles I built, standards I fought for, and mistakes I refused to repeat. The chaos I exposed forced everyone else to evolve. Revenge was never the goal. But accountability? That changed everything. So yes, one shutdown neutralized a CEO. But it also resurrected a company. And it reminded everyone of a truth they'd forgotten: ignore the engineer, and you risk the system. Respect the engineer, and you secure the future. That's not vengeance. That's balance, finally restored.